Okay. Fantastic. Right, everybody, thanks so much for joining us, for being here this Wednesday afternoon and fitting this into everybody's incredibly busy schedule as usual. I'm really excited about today because this is probably the first session so far where we're really bringing together quite sort of diverse disciplines and fields into the one seminar, which I think is really what the intention was at the outset, was to kind of see across the breadth and range of research practices and projects that kind of are encompassed by DTA. So I'm really looking forward to both of these talks, and we'll first be hearing from Dr. John Grayson. John's a senior lecturer in design at Staffordshire. He's also an honorary research fellow at the University of Birmingham, and he's a lecturer artist in blacksmithing at Hereford College of Arts, and a craft maker in his own right. His research explores 18th-century enamel trades, principally of Birmingham and South Staffordshire, the processes and context of their production and their consumption. There's more in the bio in the invite, and I'm sure John will be expanding on some of that in his talk. Thanks for being here, John. And we're also going to hear from Asad. Asad's been working in academia for about 20 years. He has a background in operational research and statistics. Asad's research is motivated by real-world problems and falls under three themes: health and well-being, wireless communication for the future, and environmental sustainability and resilience. And I think that's why I thought potentially within the context of this idea of imagining future histories for civic societies, I thought that both of these talks were kind of beautiful examples of ways that we can push into the future, but also by tracking the past. So I guess just the usual housekeeping. We are recording this talk. It'll be available afterwards on Teams. Ideally, people would just keep their mutes on while our speakers are speaking, and pop questions in the chat, or field them at the end when I'll gather all the chat questions together and hopefully have a little bit of a discussion at the end. So that'd be great. So unless anybody needs to put anything up for discussion right away, we will just move straight on, and over to you, John. Let's do this screen sharing business.
Cool, thanks a lot, Becky. This is where it all goes pear-shaped now, isn't it? So I'm hoping you can see that.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, cool. And just to remind, it's about 20 minutes, isn't it? I have a bit of a track record of over talking, so I'm just going to put the clock on.
Yeah, that's fine.
Feel free to prompt me with a few minutes to go. Okay, so well, thank you, and I've been looking forward to talking about this for a while. Some of you may or may not know, but I'm new but old at Staffordshire University. I worked here from 1998 to 2012, I think, and then I left, and I came back in the summer to teach with Jess Longmore on the Art and Design Foundation. So what I'm talking about today is, well, my title is Revaluing 18th-century Staffordshire Enamel through Contemporary Craft, and I suppose really it's talking about my PhD research and postdoc research that I did in the gap when I wasn't here, but I think it's important to say where this all started, and it did actually all start at Staffordshire University back in 2004. So a bit of context: I'm a craftsmaker, been craftsmaker since the mid-1990s. I've got a bit of a passion for industrially formed and decorated metalware. And in 2004, I was asked by Bilston Craft Gallery if I was interested in making some work in response to their 18th century enamel collection. So on the slide that you're looking at, there's a little patch box, black and white image of a house with a trifle from Bilston. And this was my first encounter with 18th century enamels from the Staffordshire region. The commission kind of lent itself to a bit of a research project, so I applied for and got a AHRC research grant, and it was the project really was an audience engagement project to help the local populace of Bilston understand the link between their industrial manufacturing heritage and contemporary craft, which was the remit of the gallery. So to do this, I made some responses to a trifle from Bilston, and I made a trifle from Bilston, as you can see on the screen. This really was my kind of, maybe I should say it was my gateway drug into 18th century enamels, because until this project, I'd never come across this genre of objects before. And I think for us in Stoke, us in at Staffordshire University, they're interesting objects because they're kind of the metal equivalent to ceramics. And I'll talk about that more later on. So they're basically a metal form covered with enamel, which is ground down glass. Anyway, suffice to say, I was exposed to these objects through this commission and got more and more interested in them. And I realised there was a huge knowledge gap around these objects, around how they were made. So my talk really is going to talk about a bit of a survey of the enamel objects, the genre, and I think you'll see the connection with ceramics and Stoke-on-Trent quite clearly as I talk through that, but also this fundamental knowledge gap that I discovered through doing this commission, that there was nothing really written about how these objects were made in terms of the metal fabrication that was under the skin of the enamel, and that was basically my PhD. So I'm going to give you a bit of a skate through this. So I don't know whether this is quite a niche genre of objects, but some of you may have come across them, especially if you're in historians of material culture. But the enamel objects I'm going to show you at the minute, they were predominantly made in the south of the county of Staffordshire, in the towns of Bilston and Wednesbury. So that's really in the heart of the Black Country as we know it now, because the county boundaries moved. It became part of the West Midland Unitary Authority in the 1960s. But what's interesting is that this particular genre of objects were the main production site was assumed to be in Battersea in Surrey, which is now in the middle of London, and the significance of the Midlands, the stuff produced in South Staffordshire was really not really recognised until the 1920s. I could talk about this particular aspect, this skewed knowledge around where the production was produced for ages, and it probably could be a PhD in its own right, but I'm going to skate on because otherwise I won't get through this. So I discovered a knowledge gap in terms of production, and there was also this kind of skewed belief that really production in the south of the county was fairly insignificant, and the stuff produced in London from a factory that only ran for a couple of years was the main area of production. So what did they produce? So when I talk about these 18th century enamels, they were producing objects to be carried on the person, snuff and patch boxes, and they also produced domestic ware, tea caddies, candlesticks and things like that. It was basically a copper form that was pressed into a shape and then coated with enamel, which is a bit like glaze on a pot. In South Staffordshire, so Bilston and Wednesbury, there was probably about 30 manufacturers, 40 manufacturers, plus allied trades producing stuff for the enamelers. And the peak period of production was from around 1750 to 1830. Interestingly, none of the manufacturers that made this stuff marked their ware with a back stamp, so there is loads of confusion over who produced what and when. They were kind of a site for innovation. One was in terms of the methods for stamping out the metal, and the other was that it was a place where transfer printing that is synonymous with the ceramics trade was utilised, and there's some scholars that believe that it might have started in the enamel trade before it migrated to ceramics. So a quick process. So what is the process? If you imagine to make an object such as this, you have to stamp a shape out in copper. So that's at the top of this kind of flow diagram. Once you've got your copper form, you have to coat it with about 6 coats of white enamel, which creates like a base coat. And then once you've got this kind of beautiful white ground of enamel on top of your copper form, then you can paint or print your decoration on. Unfortunately, unlike ceramics, the colours from one painting of decoration isn't very vivid, so you have to have multiple coats, multiple firings, and each of these stages of pressing, coating, firing pose real jeopardy to production. So it was quite a high wastage rate. So some of the objects. So in the 18th century, there was an emerging kind of middle and upper class consumer market. The consumers of the day were drawn to novelty. So objects that had intrigued, beautiful decoration that they'd not seen before, quirky forms, or were produced by innovative new processes that were kind of unusual and bewildering for the consumer, were in high demand. Another thing that was in demand was porcelain. Porcelain was seen as a high value product, as you might be aware. And at this period of time, the 1750s, there was a lot of manufacturers all over Europe were trying to crack the secret of porcelain, hard paste porcelain. So alongside trying to unpack how that could be made, there were glass manufacturers, and in this case enamel manufacturers, trying to make stuff that looked like porcelain even though it wasn't. So when we look at things like this beautiful candlestick, it kind of looks like a piece of Meissen or Sèvres porcelain ware. So this is kind of examples of the domestic ware produced, tea caddies, salts, etc. So a lot of this is tapping into the consumer marketplace at the time, the fashion for decorating your home, tea drinking, dining with guests, etc. So the enamel manufacturers really were producing items that catered for this ever-evolving marketplace. Things to do with personal hygiene and body adornment were really popular. So scent bottles, patch boxes, so that was to hold the little black beauty spots that went on you, covered the pock marks on your face. And a range of different decorating techniques were used. Some of the things that were perceived as being the high value items were these kind of painted objects in the Rococo style, because the fashionable French tastes were highly popular. But equally, other techniques such as this textile motif were utilised, where scholars think that the design was stenciled through a kind of fabric pattern. And also transfer printing. I'm just going to skate through this a little bit here. So this is a piece of early transfer printed ware by the printer engraver Hancock, who worked at the Worcester Porcelain Works, but is also acknowledged as producing enamels for, transfer prints for enamels in the early 1750s. So where did all of this take place? As I say, there was a small period of production in London, Battersea, from 1753 to 55. There was a little bit in Liverpool. Sadler and Green, the transfer printers up there, were engaged in some production. But really the hotbed of production was in South Staffordshire, so Bilston, Wednesbury, which you can see on the map here, and also in Birmingham. People think that the main production area was Bilston and then Wednesbury, then Birmingham. The trade really died out by the 1830s, in part due to changing tastes in fashion, and also European conflict was curtailing export markets, but also the Black Country was realised to be a wealth of iron and coal, and really manufacturing in that region shifted from small toy manufacturer to large scale iron founding. So my PhD really was primarily about trying to investigate how these objects were made, and that was the metal construction underneath the skin of the enamel. And at first I had some crazy harebrained ideas about using X-ray scanning and stuff like that to go into museums and scan objects. There is very little primary literature that emanates from this trade, so really objects in museums is pretty much the only source, apart from a few snippets of text. But being a craftsmaker, I realised that actually maybe I didn't need to take the technological route. Maybe my knowledge as a craftsmaker would allow me to investigate enamel objects and try and understand how they were produced. And during my time at Birmingham City University doing my PhD, I got more and more involved in a group called Accidental Historians, which was a group shared between some print scholars at BCU and some scholars of West Midland history at the University of Birmingham. And I realised that my knowledge as a craftsmaker could be used to investigate objects, and that this had a name in the field of history. It was called the material turn. So for those of you that are particularly interested in methodology, this is my methodological process. I'm not going to talk about it in great detail, but in essence, I use an object analysis method that has its roots in Prown, who is an art historian. It basically involves having a kind of visual and haptic encounter with objects, analysing them. But I used a process that brought my own knowledge as a craftsmaker, which really came from the writings of Hamling, Tara Hamling, who's a historian at University of Birmingham, to basically analyse these objects, and then use my craftsmaking knowledge later on to test theories on production. And interestingly, I use my own contemporary crafts practice to test my theories. And what this did was it developed these dual knowledge perspective around how this information was beneficial for historians, but also for craftsmakers in the present. So I'm going to move on. First of all, so we all do a literature review, but there wasn't really any literature. But there was an interesting 18th century text, which is Dozy's Handmaids of the Arts, which had some descriptions of how to build a kiln. So little snippets of information allowed me to build a bit of an understanding of the context of production, to rebuild these kilns in a virtual world. Some diary entries from an 18th century Swedish industrial spy investigated the area. But my main source of primary data was basically through object analysis in museums. And I spent a lot of time in the stores at the Museum of Wolverhampton, Museum of London and the V&A, and completely bamboozled the curators at first by saying to them that I wanted to see all the beautiful enamel objects that they got that were smashed. Because what the broken objects did was it gave me accidental windows to see the metal structure underneath the object. So I'd spend time measuring, drawing. Drawing gave an immersive experience to understand production, record how I thought the objects were made, measure the forms, and critically look at these kind of accidental windows that allowed me to look at how these objects were produced. And what I discovered was, rather than think the thinking that the objects were all stamped out of one piece, it started to become apparent that they were actually stitched together or folded and crimped by these little tabs, and they were made up out of a whole range of different components. So through doing that, it became apparent that there was this different modes of production, these little copper ties that tied things together, these little tabs that held the objects together. From that point, I had an understanding, a hypothesis of production, but what I wanted to do was to understand really the versatile nature of the process, and this is where contemporary craft came in. So I had this kind of technical dictionary of process, and I used it. I tested its viability by basically making some commissions for the Crafts Council. And I made this piece. I could talk about this for a whole talk as well, but this basically, I made a series of pieces that charted Brexit, pre and post Brexit shenanigans in the Houses of Parliament. And I applied the making process that you see on the left-hand side to the making of a piece of contemporary craft. And this gave me material understanding. And I'm not going to show the whole of this video, but I made this automata that's digital command and control. So you, come on. If we see it play, you'll see that nobody ever gets to wind the handle because the sensor trips before you get to it. So this is a piece of satirical automata. If you look at the text on it, you might get an inkling of what it's about. Quite happy to talk about that at another occasion. So this was testing the viability really of the processes. And from that material understanding, I then revisited all of my data to try and understand how these things were made, these 18th century objects, because this was knowledge that the historians and the museum curators didn't understand. They didn't understand what was happening under the skin. So through the production of replicas of the objects, using 3D printing as molds to press this ridiculously paper-thin copper foil, I tested my hypothesis on production, trying to reproduce some of these objects. And what was interesting was that I realised that through hand fabricating and press forming, you could take a very small number of the processes that were evident within the that were evident on the historical objects, and you could apply it to making a particularly robust form, and you could adapt the shape really, really quickly. So the findings went on tour. So this then was a touring exhibition. It was showed at the Victoria Street Gallery in Birmingham, and then Ruthin Craft Centre, who bankrolled it all. And then finally it finished at Wolverhampton Art Gallery. So my thesis, although it was kind of a traditional written thesis, it was also, I suppose, an exhibition format. So really, what did my study reveal? Well, interestingly, it revealed a whole load of bias amongst scholars in terms of privileging enamel objects that they perceived as being high value in the 18th century, and no research or very little research had been undertaken in terms of processes that they deemed as not having any worth. So one of those was the production of the hollow copper form. But through my analysis, it became apparent that the process of stitching together these objects from a small set number of processes was incredibly versatile. And when you looked at that in the context of what the consumer wanted at the time and what manufacturers needed to do to meet consumer demands in terms of consumers particularly wanted ever-changing products. They weren't much similar. They weren't much different to how we are today. So there was a real demand for ever-changing products. And so by uncovering this metalworking process, it became apparent how the craftsmakers of the region could adapt these processes to produce new objects to meet ever-demanding consumers much more quickly and efficiently than was ever realised. What it also did was it gave historians an insight into the complexity of manufacturing in the region, and it also made us realise that sometimes in this digital age, we realise we're forward looking and we look at digital technologies as the panacea, but what we realised is through doing this work, when you integrated a lost, defunct 18th century metalworking technique and enamel technique, and you synthesized it with 3D printed plastic molds to press the shape, you could produce some really, really complicated, lightweight enamel constructions that aren't being produced by enamelers in the present. So, and the accessibility of cheap, low-cost 3D printers kind of made this industrial process into a small-scale craft boutique process. So I'm nearly at the point where I think I'm going to wind it up because I'm out of time, but I've got a couple of slides that maybe just make visual what I've just talked about. So the analysis of the objects made apparent the complexity of the trade, all the different people involved in it that wasn't really realised prior to this study. And when we then looked at it in the context of one of the towns and the multiplicity of the different enamelers working in that area, and we looked at trade journals, trade directories, and all the other kind of trades going on, the engravers, the mount turners, so they're the people to make the little hinges to make the boxes complete. It provided a much better understanding of the rich diversity and of the region, and also the importance of interconnected trades. And that's it. I think I overrun a bit, but there we go.
I don't think you did. I don't know. I wasn't watching the time, to be honest, John, because that was so fascinating. Thank you. You may have overrun by 1 minute. I think that's all right. Thank you very much. Yeah, I've been scribbling away, and that was really fascinating, and lots of stuff I didn't know about. So what we will do, and what we have done in the past, is collect our thoughts and our questions for John, and we will hear from Asad, and then we will have a kind of collective discussion and Q&A at the end of both speakers. So if that's all right with you, John, and if those of you out there that do,
that's fine.
Don't lose track of your questions, perhaps put them in the chat now or write them on a bit of paper, and we will come back to them. So thank you very much, John. And Asad, are you standing by?
Yes,
you are. Excellent. Okay, so I'm just going to hand over to you, and you'll have to follow that, and then we will come back in. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Becky. Becky, could you please confirm that you can hear me okay and you can see my slides?
I can hear and see. Thank you.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm part of the engineering department, and I teach mainly mathematics, statistics, and operations research modules. So please accept sort of my apology, because my talk is going to be very, very different than, John's one. So now you will be hearing lots of challenges for the NHS and some data analysis and some validation verification of the results. Okay, so could be less interesting, like the John's one, unlike the John's one. So basically, I'm going to highlight the current challenges for the NHS, and then I'm going to talk about two recent projects I was involved in, and then I'm going to highlight some of my current projects. Right, so we all are aware of most of these NHS challenges, like the longer waiting time at the emergency department, longer waiting time for the diagnostic test, waiting time for the admission and surgeries, cancer treatment, readmissions, delayed transfer of care. But what I want to show you is some key statistics on these items, just to show you how deep these crises are. Okay, so let's start with the emergency department waiting time. So when a patient goes to an emergency department, government's mandate is the patient needs to be either seen or discharged or transferred to a ward, or basically admitted to a ward within 4 hours. And government target is more than 95% of patients needs to be seen by 4 hours. Now, if you look at the trend of over 4 hour waiting patients at emergency department over the years, it's increasing. And most shocking statistics is in this year February, if you look at, nearly 40% patient had to wait over 4 hours. Well, you will see probably somewhere here, a huge drop, but we know the reason why these figures dropped. The reason was, due to pandemic, due to COVID, patient didn't go to the emergency department. That's why we have seen this. But now, if you look at the trend, it's increasing every month. So that's very shocking. Right. So the next statistic is waiting time for diagnostic test. Government mandate is more than 99% of the patient should have their diagnostic test done within 6 weeks time, whereas this 1% over 6 week target was achieved only for 2013 somewhere here, and then it was increasing. So we ended up at 6% somewhere in 2020. But if you look at the the lines for since 2020, it's very shocking. But you probably know the reason, because the diagnostic center had huge backlog, so they are trying to clear this up. That's why this statistics gone up due to the huge backlog. Right, now if you look at the elective admission for surgeries, again government targets, NHS target is provide care or get the admission done within 18 weeks time on an average. But if you look at, well, let's consider what happened before the pandemic. So the average waiting time was 24 weeks. Similarly, if you look at the first cancer treatment, NHS target is provide care for more than 93% of the patients from the referral date to the first consultant appointment should have happened within 2 weeks time. But if you look at the figure, it's going down and down. So currently, well, till February this year, the figure was 78%. So there is a huge drop of you know, to achieve the NHS target for first cancer treatment, cancer appointment, consultant appointment for the cancer patients. Similarly, for the full-fledged cancer treatment should have happened within 62 days, and that should have happened for more than 85% of the patient. But if you look at the figure, it has gone down to 63% in February 2020. Now we are going to highlight two major problems for the NHS. The first one is about readmission, and the second one is delayed transfer of care. And the reason I want to highlight these two is because the project I'm going to talk about are based on these basically statistics. So the first one is about the readmission. So let's first define what is readmission. So if a patient is coming back to the hospital within 30 days of discharge, then the admission will be referred to as a readmission. So we have three kinds of, well, you can define many kinds of readmission, but in general, NHS, well, everywhere, emergency readmission is highlighted, which says a patient is coming back to the hospital within 30 days of readmission. Okay, so this 30 days of readmission is called emergency readmission. Similarly, if the patient is coming back within 90 days, then you can refer to that admission as 3 months readmission. Similarly, for 180 days, you can define 6 months readmission. But we are highlighting here 30 days readmission. So these are the volume, probably not making much sense. But if you look at this red line, this shows the percentage of readmission over time. So in 2010-11 time, the readmission was around 6%. But now in 1920, it's close to 15%. That would mean, more than doubled over the last 10, 11 years. So readmission is increasing every single month. So why bother readmission? Clearly, readmissions indicate the quality of care. And of course, higher the readmission implies higher the cost for the hospitals. Now, when I tried to dig out the causes for these readmissions, well, everyone knows. Well, I'm talking about the NHS people. They are aware that heart failure is going to be one of the main causes. But for us, if you look at the top 10 causes for readmission, then you would see that heart failure readmission is significantly higher than, readmission for the other causes. So 26.8%, well, this data has been, the data for this study came for between 4 to 6 NHS trusts, but figures are mostly same everywhere across all NHS hospitals in the UK. For example, at Royal Stoke Hospital, around 25% readmissions are happening due to the heart failure patients. Okay, so figures are pretty much similar everywhere in the UK. Now, a little bit of background for this first project, and I'll be talking about in a minute. So we can easily guess that these heart patients are more worrying than patients with other conditions. Since they are more worrying, apparently their hospital admission and emergency department admission much higher than other patients. So the first study I'll be talking about is funded by Innovate UK. There were 6 other Innovate UK heart test bed projects at the same time from Innovate UK. But this one happened at Royal Stoke Hospital, which is part of the University Hospital of North Midlands NHS Trust. The main objective for this test bed project was to introduce some digital tools, mainly 3 digital tools, and see whether through these digital tools, the hospital and emergency department readmissions can be reduced. So the first one was SMS, text-based service to give guidance how to manage their health and what to do if they are having any pain on any part of their body. The second tool was sending sort of some Word or PDF file bundles, which sort of gives the patient to how to manage their health. The third one was more like a telephone conversation based tool, which is managed by the third sector, and one telehealth coordinator was involved to provide sort of what to do, how to react if the patient is having any complications. So 3 digital tools have been tested, and the main aim was to see if these digital tools can reduce the readmission at the Royal Lister Hospital or any other hospitals within the county. At the same time, not much deterioration of health for these patients. Okay, so we selected 3 groups basically. One was the project participatory group. The second was project non-participatory group. We can refer this as non-project group. And at the same time, we have compared similar patient from the previous year. Okay, the main objective was to see whether the readmission decreased significantly or not. And at the same time, we have checked their health quality, sort of quality of life, quality of daily life through 4 standard questionnaires. So I'll jump into the main findings. So what we found is this 3 digital tool. If you are interested on which patients, how many patients used which of those 3 services, the figures are here. So our main finding was these digital tools have reduced admissions significantly, emergency readmission as well as a 3 months readmission. Well, since the project duration was 1 year, we have looked at 6 months readmission, but the figure was very low. Okay, so we have also seen that reduced a level of community care, which was another objective for the project. They were quite well for managing their own health, so improved self-management. And at the same time, we wanted to check, since we sort of expected that through the digital tool they are going to manage their health by themselves, we want them to not to deteriorate their health. So we found through the quality of life questionnaire that no, their health was quite okay, and in some cases even better than the non-project group. Probably it was sort of side effect, because they were aware that yeah, they are not going to the hospital, they are self-managing their health, so they have to lead quality life, so they were sort of aware. Maybe that was one of the reasons, but we cannot say much because it's just 1 year follow-up study, right? Now I'm going to jump into my second project, where Becky, how much time I have got? Could you please confirm?
Good question. Let's have a look. I reckon
2-3 minutes.
Oh, at least.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's going to be very difficult. Right. So delayed transfer of care is another very big issue for the NHS. Delayed transfer of care can be defined as, think about a patient. The patient is at hospital. The patient can be discharged today, but due to unavailability of the place where the patient can go, the patient cannot be discharged. So The patient is clinically ready to be discharged. Since there is no available place for the patient cannot go. And I'll show you some shocking statistics for delayed transfer of care. So on a particular day, 5,370 bed days are lost. If you multiply by 50, so £250,000 lost on a particular day. So delayed transfer of care can be very costly. Now, why these are happening? These are aged patients. Most of them are coming from care homes or home care, and the hospital, when the patient is ready to be discharged, when they inform the patient, the bed at the care homes are replaced by another patient. So the patients are continuously assessed at the hospital. On a particular day morning, the patient is ready to be discharged. They call to the council or the health and social care service. They say, we don't have any place. So the patient needs to be stayed at the hospital. We have tried to identify, based on routinely collected data, when a patient is coming to the hospital, we try to develop a Excel spreadsheet based tool to identify whether the patient is going to be a detox patient or not. We have applied mixed effect logistic regression model, and based on the estimated parameter values, we developed 8 variable prediction model. The prediction looks good, overall accuracy 70%, 80% sensitive, and around 70% specific. But let me give you one example. I'm going to take just 2 more minutes. So on a particular day at Royal Stoke, there will be, let's say, 400 admissions. 10% of them are usually going to be detox, delayed transfer of care. So 40 of them. With 80% accuracy of our model, we are going to identify 32 out of 40. But at the same time, among the non-detox patients, we have got sort of false positive rate, because our model is 69% specific. So 31% misclassification happening there. So actually 40 detox and 360 non-detox at the hospital. But our predicted model, our model is saying, our model is predicting 140 of them are detox and 292 are non-detox. So in terms of overall accuracy, it's not still there. But on the other hand, if the hospital is trying to dig this out, they try to find out 140 patients, they can easily, based on other proxy measures or variables, they can identify these 32. How? If they try to dig out where the patient is coming from, and some other, whether the patient is getting any care benefits or under any care package or not. So still they can dig out. But we want something at the time of admission. We want 95% would be tough to achieve, but we want overall accuracy 90%. At the time of admission, we want to predict that 90% of these patients are definitely going to be detox. Okay, and we want to reduce this false positive rate as well. Okay, so that's what we have done for the Royal Stoke Hospital. I am involved, well, now the first project, $500,000 project, led by Sarah Jane Jones from Health Science. I am involved 1 day per week on this project. The second project is about how the COVID vaccine respond to the cancer patients. We are comparing, healthy and cancer patients. Third one is nursing study. This is going to be an interesting study. This is going to be a crossover trial. So we will see whether a different color, colored and white crockery, do they make any difference in terms of, food intake for the patients at Royal Stoke Hospital. The last one is about, hemorrhoid patients. It's sort of a small trial. They want to check whether a less invasive procedure is slightly better than the traditional invasive approach of treatment or not. Okay, so these are the project I'm currently involved in. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. Apology for crossing the time limit. Over to you, Becky. Thank you.
Thank you, Asad. And I don't think you did. A, I don't think you did. And B, I mean, you're covering so much ground in such a speedy way. That's very impressive. And actually, I think any one of those projects you could have easily talked for your whole time on, couldn't you? So thank you for covering so much ground. I'm just making a couple of notes myself here. Right. And yes, very different frameworks for research as well, which I think might be an interesting question to get to. Let's see, are we all still there? Yes, great. So I might, John and Asad, do you want to just have your cameras on? Hi there. Asad, come back into the room if you can. Do you want to turn your camera back on, Asad? There we go. Brilliant. So I'm just looking in the chat and I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So I've got some questions perhaps for both of you, which I could maybe get the ball rolling with. And this could be, and then if other people have questions, then they could put a hand up or just to unmute yourself and come on in, because I am, I guess, really interested in thinking about the different methodological tools you both use in your research. And I might have specific questions for you first, John, if that was all right, in regard to what you were talking about. I found your methodology really fascinating, your object analysis method, and this idea of the material turn and how you came to your kind of hypothesis of production. And I really loved the phrase accidental historians. I actually I use a similar phrase a lot when I'm talking about my research, which is guerrilla historian, because that idea of sort of being able to plunder from another field, but perhaps know that you're just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of a proper research methodology. I think maybe arts and crafts practitioners, that's something we feel able to inhabit that space a little bit. So I really like that. But I guess, can I ask a really practical and possibly stupid question first?
Far away.
What is enamel?
It is literally ground down glass.
Ground down glass with paint in it, coloured.
Well, the colour is metal oxides. So if you've got any kind of ceramic knowledge, the enamel really is fairly similar to glaze on a pot. So where you've got with ceramics, you've got to make a ceramic object, a clay object. You've got to take wet squodgy clay, you've got to form it into a shape, and then you fire it. You've then got to put a nice coloured surface on, and that's your glaze, which is basically, they call it frit, but it's a kind of glass material, and it's got invariably metal oxides are used as the staining agent. So with enamel, you haven't got a clay substrate, as we call it, you've got a metal substrate, but the enamel substance that you coat that substrate with is similar, you know, for the non-expert, it's similar to enamel, to glaze. But there's lots of different sorts of enamel processes. So this particular one is in the 18th century, it was called thick enamel. We call it wet process now. But in terms of enamel, there's lots of different techniques. So there's like cloisonnier, it looks like little metal wires put on a metal surface to make cavities with glass the enamel fused into the gaps. So there's lots of different enamel techniques, and this is just one particular subset within enameling.
Right, thank you. Okay, so my proper question, now that I understand that a bit more, in relation to what you were talking about, is I'm really interested in this bias that you were talking about, and probably in relation to that knowledge gap, but also in relation to perhaps the attitude at the time to those objects, and whether you feel that is that a kind of class-based bias? When I look at those objects now, I feel that they do have a sort of kitsch value, which potentially is activated by some of that high art, low art thing.
So the origin of the bias is quite complicated, but in the 19th century, collecting of porcelain was highly fashionable. So once you got into the Victorian era, you'd got collectors of 18th century porcelain, and some of those collectors also collected glass and enamel objects, so things that they associated with the aristocracy and the kind of emerging middle and upper classes in 18th century Britain, so the bias kind of started with this collecting, because a lot of the people that were collectors were quite wealthy in themselves. So one of the main collections that I looked at in the V&A is called the Schreiber collection, and so that was collected by Lord and Lady Schreiber, who were industrialists in Wales, very wealthy, owned a lot of land, and they were big collectors of and enamels. So one of the things is the kind of background of the collectors. Because this particular factory in Battersea it was considered to be this kind of hotbed of production, because it was set up by an alderman called Jansen, and it was set up as a print decorating factory. So you've got to think transfer printing has literally just been invented. In fact, it hasn't been invented at the time that this factory's opened up. It has been, but nobody's actually patented it at that point. And this factory's set up, and people like Walpole, so of Strawberry Hill House in I forget which county it is, but in the suburbs of London as it is now, might be Twickenham way, I think. He collected a whole load of stuff to decorate his home, as people did in the 18th century. It's kind of like in the Gothic style, I think. And he created an inventory of all of his wares, and in it he logged that he'd bought some of these enamels from this factory at Battersea, owned by Alderman Jansen, and how it was innovative. So there was like these little markers put out there at the time. And so the collectors kind of jumped on the significance of this factory. It was in London. It was bankrolled by a wealthy benefactor. There was many other kind of things that linked it to aristocracy and the wealthy at that time, which I'll just talk and talk if I do. But in a sense, this created these benchmarks, these posts in the ground, as it were. And so, in effect, the collectors just assumed that all of their amazing stuff that they collected came out of this factory. Now, the thing was that at that time, you then had the emergence of museums, the South Kensington Museum and other municipal museums that opened up as part of the tendrils of this educational project that was the South Kensington Museum, the V&A. And so when these collectors were getting towards the end of their life, in a sense, they wanted to bequeath their collections to museums to basically preserve their legacy. So they gifted these collections to places like the V&A with Schreiber collection, and the Harold Raby collection, Manchester Art Gallery, and so forth. and their bias in effect travelled with the collection. So there's a really classic early V&A catalogue about their collections placed within the museum, and it says there in black and white words to the effect of there's some examples of the amazing Battersea ware in their Rococo fineness and whatever. Oh, and there's also some examples of the poor quality stuff that was produced in Bilston and the South Staffordshire region. So it's there in black and white. You can see this bias. And then it just prevails from then on, even like in the 1950s and 60s, it's still happening. And even sometimes for the uneducated in later publications. But one of the curators at the V&A was the first person to realise where the error was. And that was the slide that I showed you early on, this curator called Rackham. He did a load of work around analysing some of the objects, and he just discovered that like some of the pigments that they used that were on these objects actually didn't get invented for like 20 years after this factory had closed. You know, some of them had got transfer print images that came from a book called The Ladies' Amusement, which hadn't been printed at the time of the factory. And so that was the beginning of the unravelling. But the bias just has kind of stayed, really. So the bias about the fact that the metalworking is inconsequential, it's an easy thing. Quite a lot of the decorating techniques that aren't kind of high-class painting were rubbished. So my current research is around a process that textile printed process, and it gives you, when you unravel all of it, you see these objects in a different light. One where you start to see like kind of emergence of designing going on, the fact that different techniques to decorate this ware and to produce these forms were used to basically hook in the consumers, just like modern consumer culture today. And I think that's one of the things that's really fascinated me, was that actually that period, 1750, 1830, it's like the emergence of the modern consumer world that we live in. And as a designer, I'm interested in how we design for customers, and you see it in a sense vividly in those objects, even though it's not called design and design drawings weren't produced. You could see in the workshops the manufacturers kind of thinking, well, let's collage this technique with this technique to create a novel thing that would be awe-inspiring to the consumer.
How interesting. How interesting. And also, you know, we're sort of seeing the emergence of the art markets, myth-making, self-mythologizing, you know, as well. That's, yeah, in tandem. I've got a great question for you from Jessica, from Jess Longmore as well. So Asad, if you don't mind hanging fire, I'll ask this question on behalf of Jessica. Jessica says, John, do you consider this style of enamelling a lost art form? And if you do you have plans to share the knowledge with other craftspeople and revive the practice?
Well, the painting decorating techniques they've been around earlier than that period, you know. And they're still present now, because in a sense they are the same techniques that people use to decorate ceramics as well as enamel. But I think the more lost decorating processes are things like this textile stenciling technique, and also the use of transfer printing in its primitive form. So not wanting to talk about process for too long, but it was an engraved copper plate with pigment put on it, and then you print onto tissue paper, and then that tissue paper stuck to the side of your vessel, and then you peel the paper off and the print's stuck on the vessel, and then you can fire it. So in terms of enamelling, nobody does that anymore. Still done in ceramics, but not on enamel, and it has technical parameters that make it on enamel quite tricky. So I'm quite interested in the versatility of that, maybe, and exploring the versatility in terms of form, but also in terms of decorating, and using it as a vocabulary to further make satirical work. which is kind of my thing when it comes to my own practice. So I don't know whether I fully answered the question there, Jess, but I've tried.
Very good. Thank you.
We can talk over coffee.
Absolutely. And Asad, just moving on to you, and I guess maybe for some reason this also connects with the idea of bias, but I'm really fascinated by your projects, particularly the sort of reduction of readmissions process using these digital tools, and you mentioned 3 of them. And so I guess my question was, are those tools all apps that the patients have on a smartphone? No, because I'm wondering, what kind of barriers there might be to using those, in terms of age or income and that. Yeah. Oh, mute. Sorry, unmute yourself.
Sorry, Becky, that happens all the time. Thank you. Right. So in terms of barrier, I mean, the first one is mobile texting. So depending on, their sort of that flow company, they have sort of set of questions, first week, second week, third week, and they are sending sort of text SMS to the patients, and they are replying and sort of, whether the patient has checked this, has done the exercise or not. So it is more like, getting information through SMS service. So nowadays, who doesn't have a phone? So I don't think there is any barrier for that service. For the second one, it was slightly restrictive because, the patient we are talking about still has got average age over 60. I'm talking about the project patients, project participatory patients. So many of them, don't know how to use the, download sort of, PDF Word files from email. So that was problem for many of the participants. Probably that's why they didn't, pick this digital tool. That's why they preferred probably the other one, the text. And we found, people are more active who registered for, text service digital tool. So for the second one, there was definitely a barrier, but for the third one, there wasn't any barrier. Some of them, it's just the number they need to call, or the telehealth coordinator called them, how they are managing their health, was there any problem or no, or not, whether they need to visit the community center, community center for their health management or not, sort of, so there wasn't any barrier for the first one and the third one, some barriers for the second one. Have I answered your question, Becky?
You definitely have. Okay, I've got a follow-up question. I'm waiting to see if anyone else has got any questions. This follow-up question maybe is, I don't know. Anyway, it's my question, so here we go. Do you think, and I don't know who funded that particular piece of research, do you get the sense that those tools, those evaluation tools, or, to use those tools to kind of minimize or reduce the numbers, the backlog, the admission numbers, those sort of problems, are they band-aids on underfunding the NHS?
The first one was funded, the readmission was funded by Innovate UK, I have mentioned it. But for the second one, I forgot to mention, it's funded by the local charity, North Staffordshire Medical Institute. So the tool is now on sort of test phase, pilot phase with the Royal Stoke Hospital. They are using our tool on their dashboard. So basically the tool is generating sort of prediction of detox, non-detox patients. So it is funded, a small amount, less than 20K, around 15,000. For the first one project, since we have found this digital tool could reduce admission significantly, so they are trying to commercialize. Well, that was one of the main aim for the Innovate UK. If some of these tools are successful, whether they can be commercialized or not. So it is still with them. They are trying to get its commercialization process is very lengthy process, long process. They need to do validation, verification, and it goes different layers of NHS approval. So it is with them for the first tool. For the second one, it is being used on pilot basis. But like I said, it's still sort of, I'm not saying there are some flaws. It's more like the prediction accuracy. It's not quite there yet. So we probably need more sophisticated model to, get the higher accuracy. So we are planning to apply for more funding and see, whether we can improve that accuracy. So but to answer your question, yes, they are sort of on the test phase. They are generating sort of prediction, and in terms of whether they are really useful or not, yes, of course they are. But you need to get it right there to have it, have some positive impact.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Asad. Excellent. Does anybody who's hung in there with us, I know, thanks, Tony. Tony said thanks for the interesting talks. He needs to go. I think a couple of other people have had to go. Has anyone else got anything else they want to ask our panelists? Maybe chats over coffee, like you say, John, I think is the way to go from here. So look, I want to thank those of you that are here. I want to especially thank you, John, and you, Asad, for sharing a snapshot of what is a massive breadth of research, clearly, and much appreciated. So you're off the hook now. You're done, and thanks a lot, and we'll see you guys. Hopefully those of you that are still around could come and join us tomorrow. We've got Michael Branthwaite dialing in from Norway, so that should be interesting too. So many thanks to you both, and thanks to everybody else.
Yes,
okay, cheers, bye.